Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. My name is Bernie Schlager, and I serve as Executive Director of the Center. And we are really thrilled to welcome Rabbi Joshua Lesser, whom Rabbi Jane Littman will introduce in just a bit. Just a few housekeeping details, and that is that we're recording this today. It's being live streamed on Facebook and will also be posted on our YouTube channel. We will not, however, publicize the chat. The chat will remain private. And so welcome, and without further ado, I introduce Rabbi Jane Littman.
Thank you, Bernie. I'm Rabbi Jane. I staff the Jewish Roundtable, which is a Jewish strategic think tank that welcomes in innovative and cutting edge thinkers and ideas and shares them with people like you. We're an intersectional organization, so we have a number of these strategic think tanks, Jewish, trans, Latinx, African American, and Pacific Asian Islander. We're very pleased to welcome a new staff person to staffing our Pacific Asian Islander programming. And so we're looking forward to really upgrading that in the next 6 or 7 months. And I hope that in addition to the Jewish programming, you'll come to some of our other programs, which are, I think, equally innovative and thought-provoking. We're really pleased, I'm really pleased today to welcome our speaker, who's going to speak about what I think is a very controversial subject that is of interest to all of us, which is, what happens as, what does the next generation of gay culture look like? And what does it mean for people who are not identified in terms of sexual orientation and historically non-heterosexual ways? So, and I've known Josh for a very long time, 20 years or so at least, and have had really the pleasure of working with him and seeing his leadership skills, his brilliance, his kindness, his compassion, and his amazing courage in terms of gay rights, not only nationwide, but in the South, where it's not always so easy. He's been an extraordinary leader, and I'm delighted that he's with us today. Josh?
Thank you so much, Jane. It's really a pleasure and honor to be with all of you today. And in thinking about this, and perhaps with many queer approaches, there are so many different starting points. And so I've had to choose where to start. And so I wanted to start at this moment that many years ago, and in some ways, in thinking about this opportunity that you may have read in the promo, that some of my thinking came after an event where very publicly the community that I was serving, Congregation Beit Haverim, was described as post-gay, and in a way that didn't completely sit right with me. And I used that opportunity to do some thinking about that I wrote about publicly then. And I've continued to think about these issues, and they've grown since that time, which has been about a decade. But so even before that incident occurred at Beit Haverim, when we were called post-gay, the congregation was called gay-friendly at an LGBT event where I was being introduced. And unlike when we were called post-gay, this was not meant to be a criticism. In fact, it was said with enthusiasm describing our congregation. But it hit me in the kishkas. In other words, it felt like a punch in the gut. What was wrong with being gay-friendly? There was nothing per se, except for the fact that we were founded by LGBT people. And that even in LGBT space, still this idea of centering heteronormativity felt really challenging to me. And so, to me, I felt the term gay-friendly squarely put the wrong people at the center. And so it is true that shortly after I joined Congregation Beit Haverim as their rabbi, the number of straight members skyrocketed pretty profoundly. I was clear about one thing, and this was contained in my remark after being introduced as gay-friendly, and in my desire to correct this misnomer. I turned to the host and I said, "Excuse me, we're actually straight welcoming. After all, straight people need welcoming synagogues too." And, I have really believed this idea that straight folks need welcoming synagogues. And I would more even enthusiastically and unabashedly say that straight folks can benefit from queer-informed leadership and religious structures. I once wrote an article about that joke. And when I said that straight folks need welcoming too, I, recognized that Beit Haverim went from a congregation that was almost comprised of entirely LGBT members. Early on, there have always been one or two people for whom it was a comfortable place that did not identify as LGBT. And it has evolved from being a synagogue that was almost exclusively for LGBT folks to a congregation that I used the language was LGBT founded. And we began to serve a diverse membership that over time grew to be a straight majority. And so there is a way of what does it mean for a LGBT founded congregation to do welcoming work at the same time when so many quote unquote heteronormative synagogues are also doing welcoming work as a way to welcome LGBT folks, for us to be doing that work in reverse. And for me, it is where a lot of my thoughts have emerged about what a queer-informed space can be. And I believe it has been intentional and ongoing work. And this idea of straight people needing welcoming synagogues too is not just about being playful. There is a queer art in turning things on its head, just of its own self. But I have always firmly believed that there are spiritual queer values that benefit all people. And that perhaps is an evolution of the ways that queer congregations have thought of their purpose in the world. So that when we were called post-gay, I already had the clarity of what it was I was doing and why I was doing it. And I believe that when welcoming is done from the margins to the mainstream, it is a radically different experience. And so today I hope to unpack the word post-gay a bit, but really I don't want language to trip us up, because maybe that's a word that is not redeemable or not a word that is useful in this context, and that we need to be creating other kinds of ways of looking at things like queer informed. Or another way to see post-gay that I might raise is this idea that today I taught in my Intro to Judaism's class from Aaron Hahn Tapper's book, Intro to Judaism's, and he talks about the invisible gorilla experiment, where there's this opportunity for people to watch this video of people making baskets, I believe basketball, and then all of a sudden a gorilla walks in for a period of time in this video. Over half the people never see the gorilla, and he calls it the invisible gorilla. And that in Judaism, he was saying, particularly in the Talmud, there is a male universalism, and that when we don't acknowledge that, that's like the invisible gorilla in the Jewish landscape. Perhaps our gay male universalism of LGBT experience is the invisible gorilla that we need to acknowledge, where it's so often that default of when we talk about the gay community, and we really literally mean the male, cisgender, gay male community, and not really the fullness. And that perhaps post-gay is really just another word for queer. So we'll explore some of these ideas. But I want to share a bit about the history of LGBT synagogues and some trends, and why I think CBH was unique and a trailblazer, not just in welcoming straight folks, but in how they welcome them, and look at some of the real results. And I really want to invite people to keep me honest. You can do that in the chat. You can do that on Facebook. I am sharing things from the best of my recollection. I always think it's dangerous when somebody tries to hold up something as being the first or the only or the best, and that is not that's not my desire. But I definitely feel that there's a unique experience to be learned from having done this work, in the South, doing this work in a place where survival might look differently than on the coasts for both Jewish folks and for queer folks, and the ways that things may need to shift and change. But even before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about me as a way of introduction, to have you understand a bit about my lens. And so what I just want to quickly say is that in many ways, I've often been reticent to kind of share this so publicly. As deeply rooted as I am Jewishly, I've often understood myself to be a universalist who inherited the Jewish story. And that my understanding of my connection to the Jewish story is profound. And so it is a way that I don't claim anything else but being Jewish, except for this universalist perspective. And I think that has informed a little bit of my understanding of welcoming. And it's why this text that I want to share with you, which I believe ultimately has a queer vision towards the end, is a text that has important impact and profound meaning for me. And this is a text that was written by a cisgender Orthodox rabbi, Rav Kook. And hold on for a moment while I share it. I thought I had it lined up easily. It will take 1 second. Appreciate your patience. And I am sharing it now. So this is a text that is called the Fourfold Song by Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. We'll go all the way down here. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook was the first chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Israel, which was then known as the British Mandate of Palestine. He was known for a particular Zionist vision, which we don't need to talk about today, but he really wanted to bridge commonality between secular and religious Jews, which I think is something in the queerness of this text, or at least how I read it. And he was also often noted for his universalism. And those are the two pieces that I wanted to bring to bear. But I think this text and my connection to it says a lot about who I am. So he says that there is one who sings the song of his own soul, and in himself he finds everything, his full spiritual satisfaction. There is a person who sings the song of her people. I often translate this personally as tribe. She steps forward from the circle of her individual soul, which she finds it constrained and not an ideal foundation. She aspires towards heights. She clings with a delight to the entirety of the people, Israel, and in solidarity sings its song. She shares in its pains, revels in its hope. She contemplates with exalted and pure thoughts about its past and its future, and probes its spiritual essence with love and a wise heart. So I just want to stop here and kind of begin I love this idea that at any given time, we as people are singing one of, in this case, 4 songs. So that there is a way that we are resonating with a particular kind of vibration of the world. Sometimes we're deeply connected to our own soul. When I look at this from a queer lens perspective, I often think that there is a part of our development because of sometimes either the exclusion or the oppression that we have felt, that the healing and the song of our own soul is so essential because it has been repressed. And so while somebody might think that this is a very narcissistic or self-involved song, for me, it is often a place of important development of fidelity to self, which in queer identity for me feels so essential that in the messages that religious tradition can bring, that our soul's song and the fidelity to our soul's song feels incredibly important. And we should not overlook that for many of us, that has been a gateway to our own survival, and then the ability to share and connect with other songs along the way. And then there's the song of the people. And I think that, again, as somebody, we're going to get to the song that I most identify with. It is not this song. I'm not a tribe person in many ways. There are challenges for me around nationalism as a primary song. But I think that there's a way where, in terms of creating a sense of safety and creating a sense of kinship and family and communal solidarity, the song of the tribe is very important. And when I think about the first congregations that I served in Philadelphia and as an intern in New York City at CBST, that many people were singing the song of kind of the queer Jewish tribe. And that felt like it was important to build up and to acknowledge and to say we exist and it's powerful, and to do this both with love and a wise heart was much of the work, I believe, that has been done at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. And that there's a lot to honor about that song. And then there's the third song. There is a person whose soul is so expansive that it broadens beyond the boundaries of the people Israel to sing the song of humanity. Their spirit continually grows with the exalted loyalty of humanity and its glorious image. They yearn for humanity's general enlightenment. They look toward its ultimate perfection. From this source of life, they draw all of their thoughts and insights, their ideals and visions. I think just as a human being, this is often where I want to kind of allow my song to rest. And I think it informs why I had a particular openness to straight community joining the congregation. In that, for me, I felt like that there was a possibility beyond the tribe song where there was a union. What I'll say, and maybe talk a little bit more later, is that what I noticed for a period of time in the very beginning of what I called the grand experiment of straight people and LGBT people living in spiritual community together is this tendency for the LGBT people to ground a little bit more deeply into the tribal song, to say, you don't know what my life's experience is like. We do not have the same experience. And the straight members of community would often be, we are all one community, and then really like lead into this song to the absence of recognizing that there was any particular kind of difference. To where one High Holy Days, I gave early on a sermon saying that we have to recognize that both of these songs are true at the very same time, and that sometimes the spiritual goal is for us to have moments of transcendence, but that our lived lives outside this door, even in the parking lot, and often in the building too, but even let's say we were at our best in the building together, all loving each other and recognizing our common shared universal humanity, that once we stepped into the parking lot, our life trajectories were vastly different, and that could not be ignored. And that part of our work was to be able to hear each other's songs a bit more distinctly and take that in. And then lastly, the fourth song, it's really not lastly, the pentultimately. And there is a person who rises even higher until she unites with all of existence, with all creatures and with all worlds, and with all of them, she sings the song of the cosmos. This is the person who engaged in Perek Shirah, which is a particular text that recognizes that every living or every entity in creation, not necessarily living, or that even rocks and rivers and animals are part of this beautiful chorus. Every day is assured that he is a child of the world to come. And so here's that transcendent place. Is that post-gay? Is that queer-informed? I'm not sure. What to me does feel queer, and what feels like incredibly possible, what I saw the mandate or the opportunity of spiritual leadership for queer visionary stance is this next piece. The person who rises with all these songs together in one ensemble so that they all join their voices. Together they sing their songs sweetly, each supplying its common human being with fullness and life, the voice of happiness and joy, the voice of rejoicing and harmony, the voice of celebrating and the voice of holiness, the song of the soul, the song of the tribe or nation, the song of humanity, and the song of the universe. They all mix together with this person at every moment and all times. And this simplicity in its fullness rises to become a song of holiness, the song of the divine, the song of Yisrael, in its essential strength and magnificence, in its integrity and magnitude. It is a simple song, a doubled song, a tripled song, a quadruple song. It is the song of songs, Shir HaShirim, of Solomon, the sovereignty who is characterized by wholeness and by peace. And so even reading this text again, I just find myself delighted by this possibility of this idea of what we can do from the margins is, I believe that so often we know how to weave these songs together, that we have a particular attuning to the different songs for the potential of healing. And so for me, this is an introduction of the kind of rabbinate that I've tried to live out, and kind of what I'd say is the lodestar of what does it mean to be part of a human people that has the potential to grow and to learn from each other, even when there is difference and differentiation and even sometimes conflict, which certainly in our community there has been. So I want to scope back out and talk a little bit about just some of the history. I've gleaned this history. I'm not a historian, so I don't know if this is 100% correct. So please, if history is ever 100% correct, I'm actually teaching that right now, so I can't even believe I just said that came out of my mouth. But a lot of kind of organized gay congregational life started in the 70s when we think about North America. And in 1972, Beth Chaim Chadashim was founded and was the first LGBT synagogue in the world. That's what they claim. And the first LGBT synagogue recognized by the Union for Reform Judaism. So 1972. What I want to say here is that this is also a profound time of women re-envisioning and reclaiming and wrestling with Jewish tradition. And in my personal kind of journey, and what I often say as often as I can, that the women who did this work are the people who made it entirely possible for me to be a rabbi. And without the pioneering and the threshing and the wrestling, I don't think that there would have been the kinds of openings. And so for me, I can't ever acknowledge my own journey without acknowledging the women that came and basically worked to reclaim a different vision. And so I don't know the ins and outs of BCC's origins, but I'd like to envision, and can't imagine that it would have been otherwise, that this isn't part of the same kind of activity and thinking about how to re-envision Jewish life. In 1973, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which claims to be the world's largest LGBT congregation, followed by Eitz Chaim in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale, Wilton Manors in 1974, followed by Chicago, 1975, or Chadash. Also in 1975 was the Metropolitan Community Temple Mishpacha. I had no idea until preparing for today that this is most likely that in the Christian world, the metropolitan community churches were in conversation with the synagogue world, right? And so that in many ways, the name of the community at that time, which is now Beit Mishpacha in Washington, D.C., was founded in 1975. And I just want to kind of say, just for the Yiddishists, even as Ashkenormative as this is, they were Mishpacha, is how their name was listed. 1977, Shar Zahav was founded. And that was also the same year that the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Union for Reform Judaism's principal body for rabbis, adopted a resolution calling for legislation decriminalizing homosexual acts between consenting adults and calling for an end to discrimination against gays and lesbians. So some of this is about behavior, and some of this already is about identity in terms of bringing these two ideas into a mainstream Jewish experience. The resolution called on all Reform Jewish organizations to develop programs to implement this. In the 1980s, 1984, Reconstructionist Judaism became the first Jewish denomination to openly allow gay and lesbian rabbis and cantors. And in 1985 is when Beit Haverim started meeting. It was, at that time, just a group of people called Haverim, friends. It was a social group of mostly Jewish gay men. A few lesbians would come around from time to time. And at a Passover Seder, which feels to me very profound and part of the narrative of Beit Haverim's formation, this group of friends realized we don't need more social activities or opportunities. What we need is a spiritual community. And so they went about organizing as a congregation. And that I say this jokingly, but it's true. That's where the lesbians came in. They came in as the lawyers who brought in the bylaws and helped them incorporate as a 501c3. And in many ways, at that point in 1986, Beit Haverim started as a LGB congregation of lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks. So this idea that, Beit Haverim in many ways is almost 15 years later than a lot of what's happening in some of the other parts of the world. It is the only Reconstructionist identified congregation. Not that, let's say, like CBST has Reconstructionist leadership with Rabbi Kleinbaum, but that this congregation in many ways, and I think some of why it went the way that it did was informed by, I think, a Reconstructionist vision of a grassroots democratic Jewish process that was very much less interested in what the movement was dictating, but really paying attention to what was present at this time. And so one of the other interesting things is, and I think it is because it's the South, I mean, I heard the same story in Philadelphia that I'm about to tell you, and then it was rumored in other places. But during the AIDS epidemic, in the beginning, in the 80s and even through the 90s, gay men, and often their Jewish gay men and their Jewish parents were not welcomed in congregations. And there were stories of parents trying to speak to their rabbis about their children's diagnoses, where the rabbis were not as pastoral or caring or compassionate as we would want. And so often the parents were the first straight people. Sorry, I got choked up a little bit because I had the opportunity to meet some of these parents when I first came, and to think of a Jewish community that wouldn't offer solace or support. And then this idea that then gay community wouldn't welcome those parents also feels particularly relevant. And so in some ways, this began to change the very fabric. And I think because we were in the South, there were far less resources. And so, of course, Beit Haverim became a safe harbor for some of those first straight members. Many of them were actually parents of children who had already died, who were not members, but didn't have a place for their grieving. And so that feels a pretty profound way of thinking about how post-gay gets started, is this very organic, responsive, loving, compassionate response to the community. But the story that I first actually encountered in Philadelphia, it was shocking then, and then to be repeated in Atlanta. And I wouldn't be surprised if you who are listening on Facebook and here in this room and on YouTube, if this happened in your communities. But rabbis were not doing the burials of Jewish people who died of AIDS and HIV. And it was actually Christian ministers. And when the numbers of people who were buried by Christian clergy became known, that is when the Jewish community, I think, had a moment of reckoning and honestly a little bit of shame. I think it was shocking, but they had to do some examination. And so in the early 90s, Beit Haverim partnered with Jewish Family, and in Atlanta it's called Career Services. In many places it's called Children's Services. I would rather our focus be on children, but careers are important too. So Jewish Family and Career Services hosted a conference on AIDS and the Jewish community. And it was a groundbreaking conference, particularly in the South, and it brought awareness to something that had been hidden within the Jewish community, and it wanted to be able to provide resources. Beit Haverim at that time had founded another organization called AIDS Chaim, a play on the Tree of Life, where they were delivering meals to people living with AIDS, and were invited to present some of their story and journey at this conference. And lo and behold, there were a number of straight people who met these people for the first time and thought like, wow, we want to hang out with these people. This is the kind of Judaism that we want. And again, while certainly the Reform synagogues in Atlanta have often had a liberal worldview, they weren't queer informed or have an understanding, or their idea of welcoming was very much come be like us in their welcoming. We'll accept or tolerate you if you are like us. And so in many ways, that's why Beit Haverim formed, is because there was not a place where people felt they could be unabashedly themselves. Our directory in the very beginning, and I say our, I actually was a guest at Beit Haverim at this time. I was a teenager when Beit Haverim first started. I visited when a Hanukkah party, and I saw all of these Altacockers in their 30s. That's a joke. But at 19, I saw only folks in their 30s. I went with my best friend. Like, we walked in and we walked out within 5 minutes. So that was my first interaction. But in the very beginning, Beit Haverim's membership directory looked like a Alcoholics Anonymous guidebook. Nobody had their last names. It was only first name and initial. And there was this kind of shroud or this cloak of secrecy. And it wasn't ever in their imagination that straight people, except for people who already saw themselves some way marginalized, would ever want to be a part of this community. And honestly, the first straight people came in with a bunch of chutzpah because they said two things. We find what is happening here incredible and amazing, so we are not going to join quietly. So they asked for permission, which was, I thought, really interesting, but they said, please know, we're going to let our friends know about the kind of Judaism that is happening in these walls. And they said, as their numbers grew within that first or second year, for us to really to stay, we're going to need to have a community school, a school to be able to raise and educate our children. And at this moment, Beit Haverim had this watershed moment to think about, should they start a school? Could straight folks take leadership within the congregation? Could a straight person be a president? All of these questions started bubbling up at this time, precisely because when, this idea that we were called post-gay, around 2007 or 2010, that because we had let in all these straight folks, there was really an incredible amount of intentionality in the beginning of recognizing that straight folks were going to be coming. And so this idea of what to do and to solve problems. And there was a tremendous debate whether straight people could join the board. And ultimately the congregation rallied around, but it was even a bitter conversation at times. This idea that they did not want to create a congregation that modeled a second-class citizenship that they saw in what they would have called heteronormative congregations. And so in order, what I would say was a queer value of solidarity, it meant that they had to give up some comfort to allow the leadership of people who were coming to throw their lot in their lives. There was a profound stressor in the community. If you remember, the Olympics were in Atlanta. There was bombings that happened during the Olympics, and one of them was of a lesbian bar. And one of the things that I think became a cornerstone and a big separation in the history of our congregation is that in this bombing, I think it was a Thursday night, or maybe it was a Wednesday, but that Friday night, every single gay, lesbian, bisexual member showed up at synagogue, even though people were scared, but they wanted to be with each other regardless, whereas almost all of the straight folks stayed home. And it was this kind of shocking recognition. I was not the rabbi at the time. My understanding is that my predecessor understood that this was a moment where deep education was needed as a way for the straight folks to really understand what did it mean to throw their lot in with each other. And I credit her, Rabbi Leila Galberner, in bringing in some of that education so that what could have been a rift or a separation rather became a moment to examine as a community about what does safety really look like and who is truly safe in those ways. And I think that set the stage for me when I came shortly after and served as the rabbi, in part because of the text I introduced you and my worldview, partially because I grew up in Atlanta and people knew me. You know, people drove my carpool. Like that was one of the things. Like I remember, so straight folks saw me as a known quantity and not somebody who was a stranger or an outsider. I don't know enough of the other rabbis' journeys, but I don't know if there is another rabbi who has served a congregation in which the community was small enough where the kind of mainstream community knew that child. I grew up in Orthodox day school here in Atlanta. And so my teachers were still here. There was a way where, even though I came in as a queer activist, I was a member of ACT UP and came in with a activist and advocacy worldview, I also was seen as a known quantity. And I think in a lot of ways, it led to a flood of straight people continuing to come and to join the congregation. And that is when we began to be called straight welcoming, because to some people outside the congregation, this phenomenon was happening. But did it happen in an assimilationist way? I think is a really important question. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to hold up that this is a time and a way where there was a moment of us being an experiment. One of the things that I knew is that we had to stop identifying as a gay synagogue or an LGBT synagogue. I talked about us, I shifted the language so we were an LGBT-founded synagogue, and that we were an experiment of LGBT folks learning to be in spiritual community with straight folks. So as I begin to wrap up, I just want to begin this reflection of when the word post-gay began to be used, not just in the article towards me, but it became kind of proliferated around 2010. And it became very popular in a book called There Goes the Gayborhood by Amin Ghaziani. And he basically shared the story about Nate Silver, who was the founder of statistics blog 538. And when Nate correctly predicted the election, Out magazine named him the gay person of the year, the LGBT person of the year. But in this interview that Out magazine said, he referred to himself as saying, to my friends, I am kind of sexually gay, but I'm ethnically straight. And that brought a lot of ire and a lot of attention. But this is what Ghaziani is pointing to as a post-gay mentality. This idea that the world was shifting enough that people's sense of who they were not going to be so identified by their own gay or lesbian identity. And that's where this idea for me of the invisible gorilla in the room, I think that comes from a very privileged, particular aspect of the gay male community, rather than what I would say and what I saw, and as I kind of wrap up for some questions, is what I told the congregation when we began to feel the tension of so many straight people joining. I said to them, in my vision of Tikkun Olam, I don't know if this will happen, is that, yes, LGBT folks will have children, but it is already clear that the straight folks are bringing their kids now, and our Hebrew school is growing. There have been times when our Hebrew school was 130 kids at its height. Being raised in queer community, I didn't know that was going to happen. But what I said is, imagine a community where children are being educated by queer informed curriculum and having a queer rabbi and having queer family members what will it mean for how they identify and who they will become? And that for me, as a gay man who does like to be in queer community and sing my song of the tribe from time to time, I was like, at that time, let's lean into things like Nehirim, where we can go, for that exclusive community. But can we give up comfort to hold this vision of what I called a queer tikkun olam that created a community for children to emerge in ways that they didn't? And the result is, 22 years later, we have kids who are identifying in so many different interesting ways in their gender and their sexual orientation that even us folks have to begin to reevaluate our own idea. And that, for me, is post-gay in the most positive, queer-informed, delightful way. So I'll wrap up with that. I could talk for another hour about this, but I want to hear your questions.
So we're a relatively small group. I don't think we have to be particularly formal about this. You can, if your camera's on, you can just wave your hand, or you can use the chat, or if your camera's off, there is a way to raise your hand in the participants tab. So I'm going to start because Josh, I think your brilliant conceptual model of what the two different ways use the term post-gay, and that one of them is the Nate Silver assimilationist, that that you become post-gay by becoming basically straight with a homosexual sexuality. And then the other one is like to just queer it all up, that we break all the models, all the heteronormative structures, and see what is emerging particularly in the next generation. I think, and that both those things could be called post-gay is just extraordinary. And I really appreciate the clarity of that model and what it means. And so I'd like to, I think, focus more, since the first one is really basically boring. Let's focus on the second one and tell me what you're seeing. So you said, you're seeing all sorts of kinds of things, but I'd like to hear what that means.
I mean, so I've begun to see the gender exploration of people of all different kinds of sexual orientations, so that there is a greater liberation with what gender expression looks like on a general level. One of the things, I'm gonna quickly share my screen again, and Beit Haverim, my understanding, borrowed this prayer from Shar Zahav and then made it their own with a particular kavanah. And so for more than 22 years, I was there for 22 years, every single Shabbat, the straight folks would join in saying, as gay and lesbian Jews, we are aware of the lost integrity we suffer due to pressures of the larger society. And if you read this entire prayer, it ends up with that we want the fullest creative expression as Jews and as gay people be among the blessings you bestow upon us. Straight people said this prayer as allies. Now, they wrestled with it. I had thousands of conversations, but a couple things happened. One thing that happened is that people began to understand the queer Jewish wisdom of navigating through the closet and being able to be authentic, self-expressed, and having fidelity to self were values that were available to everyone, and that they themselves were enriched by this. We did a survey about 6 years ago to see where our kind of allegiances still were, and I wondered if we still wanted to identify as an LGBT-founded synagogue or as a Reconstruction synagogue, because I thought our change was so much. 93% of the synagogue felt completely connected and committed to this idea of being queer identified and queer informed. We've jokingly said that our tagline should be queers of all orientations. And so that there is a way where people have been able to queer their lives. I think it's how they've organized their relationships have changed. What does it mean, how they think of families? But my favorite thing is that one of our transgender teens, for their sister's Brit Mitzvah, rewrote the prayer on their own and then asked, could they introduce it? And so now our prayer says, as gay, lesbian, transgender, and queer Jews, we're aware of the lost integrity. We have found the way for our children to be the leaders and to share that the liturgy wasn't working for them. Can we bring in new liturgy? And this wasn't without a little bit of like, are we being displaced? But this is now what is embraced. And 3 years later, the question is this liturgy enough? Did this have, where is the expansion here? So these are the kinds of things that I'm beginning to see. And I see parents who, when their children come out, being agile and loving and compassionate, and then came to me with the questions of, can you help me think through what would be the best way to think about sleepovers? Or how do I protect my child in this way? Rabbi, what should I know about sexuality so that I can help my child develop a healthy sense of who they are? Those are beautiful questions to be happening in a synagogue that I don't think is happening in many other congregations. Honestly, it has been the straight members of our synagogue who have come to talk to me about sex and sexuality in their relationships. I think some of that has to do with projection onto a queer identity, but it also has meant that it has allowed me to support pastoral, healthy relationships based on egalitarian loving models.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I love the two prayers you shared. I noticed that the second one, the one that's more contemporary, ties in the Jewish experience. And in fact, that old Shahar Zahav prayer always struck me as so strange to be about, for those of us in hiding when, it's like Jews are post-Jews in America in the nasty, not nice way that it's used. And that, yes, I'm an assimilated, white, privileged American, Ashkenazi American with a Jewish religiosity, right? As opposed to, what Judaism was, which is a diverse way of, stirring it all up. And so I like that that's, and I think that that the synagogue gets a lot of credit for not only giving voice to queer identity, but to Jewish identity in that way, and seeing re-queering up Jewish identity.
And I think that that's quite possible, that can also be part of a Southern phenomenon, because there is a greater marginalization of what does it mean to be Jewish in the South. And I think also pride in the best sense. But I also feel like the other thing that I see happening is that in our ability to do all of that, it has created opportunities for us to do some simsum, both as Jews and as queer folks, to make space for some of the racial justice that needs to happen, and not always have our story be the story of primacy. I remember when I was at CBST, my experience was such, and this was in 1996, where I began to get worried, was as I felt like there was this revolving door of people would come in and share their wounded stories that were very traumatic and very harmful, and it would reopen, it felt like everybody's wound. And I felt like we would start back again. And so it felt like there was this perpetuating cycle. And so part of what I've wondered is, by some of the health, and not every straight person wants to say as gay and lesbian Jews. And so that who are comfortable with being identified as belonging to a gay founded, LGBT founded synagogue. And so there are already some kind of filters for who can actively have their ego strength such that they know a little bit about solidarity and allyship from the get-go. And to understand that has also allowed us to be better allies in other spaces as well, which feels really essential to queer identity. And maybe also another way to look at post-gay in terms of what are our responsibilities beyond just LGBT responsibilities. One of the things I saw that Larry Neff put in the chat, this idea of what happens when synagogues merge into mainstream synagogues, as in Philadelphia and Chicago. I think that I was very clear. I gave a sermon about this in Atlanta because there are times when I felt like that there was a nostalgia for a Beit Haverim that never existed. That we had this sliding doors moment. If you're familiar with the, with the movie of like going one way or another, that somehow we took the wrong sliding door and we could have been this queer, exclusive salon synagogue where the highest thinking and the best parties and the greatest fashion, which never was present at Beit Haverim. Well, I shouldn't say that. We have an award for accessorizing, but even still. And that was just never the possibility. And I pointed to congregations like Or Chadash and Beit Ahava in cities larger than Atlanta, Jewish communities larger than Atlanta, that lost a good part of their self-determination by becoming a chavurah within a larger Reform congregation. And so, I think you become an affinity group rather than a community that can have self-determination. And so one of the things that, I would argue back about like being criticized for the move that we did, it was a move about our survival. We are not a chavurah of the temple in Atlanta. And in fact, I think I was so sure of this endeavor, I created an organization called the Southern Jewish Resource Network for Gender and Sexual Diversity as the founder, that was responsible with, folks like Joel Kushner to create, be part of the Welcoming Synagogues Project, whereas the temple, which is one of our closest congregations, has a welcoming entity. And there are a good number of LGBT folks that belong there. And so, I had a vision that if you are a Reformed Jew, you should have a Reformed congregation that you can belong to, and that Jews who might be post-gay in a different way could find homes and congregations that would acknowledge their lives more meaningfully. And so I created an organization to do that work, but that also freed Beit Haverim to determine what it wanted to be and not have to be everything to every single gay and lesbian person, but really had the potential to queer things in a way that I believe brought post-gay into a positive worldview.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm a student at Pacific School of Religion, so this is all. I feel like I'm learning a lot here, and so I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Post-gay dialogue, it's something that's happening among young people like my age a lot. Of like, what is queerness today? What is gender today? I think one question I kind of have is does post-gayness in the sense also imply post-straightness? Because I think part of the hesitation around perhaps, or when there's a critical view of like the post-gay, and also feel free if I get any of this wrong to call me in on that. But it's part of the fear is that is perhaps that, well, post-gay just is going to allow, if straight people have, said terrible things about gay people for centuries, or not decades, I don't know, centuries, then they're just going to continue doing that if we stop claiming our gayness and showing people, not in a sense respectability politics, but just showing what gayness can be or queerness can be, and like how it's its own identity that can benefit people. So I guess what I'm wondering is then, what does post-gayness mean for straight people? Are straight people invited to also, because gay people, we have to think about our sexualities and straight people don't. often do that. And I think what I'm hearing from the lesson of your synagogue is perhaps that straight people did start to actually think about that. And yeah, I guess that's what my question is. What does it mean for straight
I mean, I believe it's a powerful experience to actively choose to identify with a marginalized framework and then to right size one's experience within that. And not that all straight people did that really well. And as Beit Haverim looks for its next rabbi, I think this question of what happens if it's a straight rabbi, I think, is very much kind of up and a live question for them. Some of the straight rabbis who've led Or Chadash or led Beit Mishpacha, or, at different times, have been really solid, strong allies and have been able to do kind of work. But there is a way where they don't bring in a queer worldview. A staff member that I work with basically said, Josh, just in the short months that you've stepped away, I didn't realize it's not that you brought a queer lens to the work that we did here together. You are a queer lens. And I think that's, I think that's who we are. And this is a straight person, but who now says that she doesn't want Judaism without queerness. That is that's the Judaism. And I think that to the way where I equate a particular kind of authenticity with queerness and everybody being able to kind of connect to the ways that they feel marginalized and recognize that there's strength there, I do think that we're opening this kind of, I love this idea of post-straight. Thank you. I feel gifted that kind of term because for me, a lot of the work that I've been doing with trans and non-binary folks has me reevaluate what sexuality is and what gay is and what, and so I've always been someone for whom queer has been my strongest identifier. I haven't corrected people when they call me gay. For me, that is about, I always want to kind of sit with a countercultural view and look at things from different perspectives to get to Jane's question about queerness. For me, it has always been kind of looking at the side of the margins and questioning and bringing that kind of perspective. But it has also been my own recognition of the ways that even when I have opportunities to identify with the mainstream, not to be blind to my privilege, but to be very aware of where truly I believe my spiritual strength comes from. And that really does come from a queer identity that I do want to make available to straight folks if they have this kind of queerness. This idea of queers of all orientations, I do think became real in our community because everyone became marginalized by the larger Jewish community. We all got treated poorly together in some ways, which made how we treated each other inside the building often more meaningful. Joel.
Oh,
Okay,
also, no, David had his hand up first.
Oh, I'm
so-
sorry.
Sure.
I also want to say what is queer is Donald's question. I just amplified it.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sure. David, you want to go first and then
Yeah.
Donald?
Sure. Am I audible?
Yeah.
You are.
Yippee. Hi. Sorry I was
Hey,
late.
David.
So I'm wondering whether the stream of of queer people who came to Beit Haverim, how it, and I got here late for your talk, but would you describe it as having changed or broadened? Were you still getting some of the people who were coming out of the bruised, the straight abuse experience, or did you start to get really the people who were already engaged in their queer experience?
I think that's a really powerful question. I mean, for sure, there were both, and I think that there are ways where sometimes the folks who came from a more bruised experience or were still kind of working things out, more strongly identified with me and less so the congregation, and that it provided me opportunities to do pastoral care and provide that kind of support. over time, because in the last 5 years, more and more trans and non-binary people found their way to Beit Haverim, who came with a particular sense of lack of welcoming and also a desire for a different, an even greater radicality than Beit Haverim necessarily possessed. And there was resistance, at Beit Haverim as well around utilizing pronouns and thinking and understanding, even though we did lots and lots of education. And so one of the things that I began to talk to people all the way around is this, a very common idea of the difference between intent and impact. And so I did a lot of education within the congregation about realizing that everybody thinks that they have really good intent here, but often the impact can be very challenging. And that was not just around queerness and people who were having a more tender experience and folks on a gender spectrum, but also Jews of color, et cetera. But some of the queer folks that came, I said, look, if you are looking to belong to a synagogue like Beit Haverim, some of the work that we need to do together and to even see if it's possible is, well, I will always talk to people about the difference between their intent and their impact, and for them to be responsible for their impact. Is there any space for you to create an opening to understand a bit of their intent, to soften the impact? Because part of what it means to join here is that we're all growing and learning together. And while I will serve as an advocate and disrupt things that feel harmful to you when I can, I cannot guarantee that you won't have a challenging experience. We have guests, we have people who come into this space. And so this idea of a purity, and so I felt it was my responsibility to share with people who needed something other than what a mixed congregation could provide, should be able to have the opportunity. So I used one table, because it was mostly younger folks, as a way to encourage queer folks to have Shabbat dinners together, who weren't necessarily wanting to be in mixed community as diverse as Beit Haverim.
So thank you for that, for the answer. And also that question that you posed to them is pretty brilliant. And I would love that to become part of the wider discourse as we, the world, move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Joel, you had a question?
Sure. So I'm really, as I sort of mentioned in the chat, really glad that we have this on tape, if you will. I mean, I've heard Josh, you talk about some of this before, but it's just capturing history is really critical, and especially as sort of time goes on and you're at a unique point in your journey. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for CLGS to host it. So 16 years ago, I founded an institute on Judaism and sexual orientation, and then Judaism, sexual orientation, gender identity as we evolved. And once I kind of started learning the history and lecturing on it, I was using sort of, and actually got to visit Beit Haverim. I was using post-gay, like, oh, this is I was using that term to describe that, and maybe sort of Michael Latz's congregation that he founded in Seattle. And people were like not happy with that term, in 2006, 7, back then. But I guess this question for you is a little bit, perhaps a shift, but then the question was like, what about, queer synagogues in their place? And I, sort of had my take on it. And, and I've kind of moved on in some of my work. My primary work is now focused on sort of pastoral care, but you've stayed in it, even though now you've transitioned. And what do you see as those people that still need, queer spaces? And now those numbers have shrunk, to a few. And I'm interested in your thoughts on what's the future for those types of spaces.
So just because I believe it's in the history, Shir Chadash, I believe, is Michael Lass's congregation. He serves them. He wasn't the founder, and I believe Stacy Offner, Rabbi Stacy Offner.
I was actually talking about the first one. He went to
Oh,
Shir
gotcha.
Kadash. He
Gotcha.
founded one in Seattle or Portland before that had this flavor of
Okay,
queerness and diversity and straight. Yeah, but
gotcha.
yeah.
Just got to correct that because I wouldn't want Rabbi Stacy out. Like she was the first queer rabbi hired by a mainstream organization. So, I think it's really important. Like here in Atlanta, my understanding, because I offered them a little bit of support, there was a chavurah called Pomegranate Rose, and it brought in the kind of often the two things that have felt very essential of queerness and anti-Zionism. Like I feel like in this kind of generation, that for a lot of folks, queerness and anti-Zionism go together, and that is even more marginalized in the larger Jewish community. And so, as someone who does not identify as anti-Zionist, I am somebody who is a stand for Jews to be welcomed and seen and have institutions that that regardless of how they identify exist. And so I would say some of the children, the queer kids of my community were coming to this chavurah. So I wanted to offer it support. And so I wonder, like this one table idea, like I wonder if there are going to be smaller, almost atomistic communities and opportunities, and if there are ways, and that as synagogues become less and less relevant in general, and we are finding more communities that are more pop-up oriented. So a little bit to the consternation, not intentionally, of some of my community members, I did offer 2 High Holy Day experiences very thoughtfully, very, like at times that they weren't doing anything, all of this kind of stuff, that were contemplative. And really my hope was to create integrative experiences for people trans-pandemic, that, finding these ways that actually was not necessarily identifying as queer, but because I'm so identified with queer, there were some queer folks that showed up. And so I think that part of like the new experience is going to be people finding what it is they need in different ways and kind of creating constellations. And that an element is going to, like, that's why a one table Shabbat dinner might be enough until perhaps like the founders of Beit Haverim over a Passover table say, hey, we need something more. Let's build that. Or a small chavurah. But I think that we are moving into a atomistic time in Jewish life in general. Atlanta is just about 10 to 15 years behind what's happening in other Jewish communities. So we're not facing that fragmentation as strongly, but it is definitely at our doorstep. And I think that will affect the queer world as well. And I also would say, Joel, what I don't know is there are so many exciting queer folks becoming rabbis right now. And so like I'm waiting to see what it is that they're going to create to respond to this need. And so part of what I want to do is support the next generation of rabbinic leadership enthusiastically to meet that question. In some ways, I think recognizing that I want to pivot towards spiritual direction and kind of, as you were saying, kind of this pastoral moment, that may be something in our mutual transition in terms of where we are and what it is that we have to offer feels really important. And for a different topic at a different time, I'm really interested in perhaps sharing with this community or thinking together with other folks about why queer spiritual direction is what is needed for this world in this moment beyond just queer people.
Sounds good. So we're coming to time to close. And I really want to thank our presenter, Rabbi Josh. You have been, fabulous, as I knew you would be, giving us all kinds of wonderful food for thought, which I really appreciate. And I also want to say how much I appreciate you bringing in historical sources and giving us a chance to integrate Jewish textual tradition and new ways of looking at it. And I want to thank you for your rabbinic as well as your leadership teaching. Our next program is in October. It's called The Ark, and it's a video presentation of video diaries of how to survive during lockdown. And it's made by, it is, as we're talking about the next generation, it is very much a art piece of a different generation and a queer sensibility. And I hope that you'll all be with us on Thursday, October 21st for the Ark. Bernie, do you want to come on and give us a closing?
It looks like his video and audio turned off.
Oh, no. All right, well, then I will take his place for a moment, though I cannot at all. And I really want to thank each of you who is here. I greatly appreciate it. This program is important to us because it is, in a certain way, what Rabbi Lesser has been talking about, which is we are a queer Jewish space here, that we are intersectional with other diverse groups of queer people, and in a larger way, we are on the campus of a liberal Protestant seminary that is, welcoming is an understatement, that highly supports a certain kind of vision out into the world. And so all those different layers of coming together, I want to thank each person who's here, because I know you also bring diversity, and each one of us comes with our own personal experience and how it's interpreted through a religious lens, a queer lens, a Jewish lens, or any other way that you're experiencing it today. And I want to thank you all, and I hope I'll see you next month. Take care.
Jane, are you still there? Sorry.
I am.
On my laptop, my screen went blank. So I'm just, everything.
Sorry.
I don't know what happened, but it's all recorded. That was really great.